One of my favorite fabrics to sew with and to wear is our Batik linen. Today we're going to talk about our Batik linen, and we're going to sew a Fira top patterned by Lisa & Company. Hi, I'm Diane with SewBatik, and thanks for joining me today. Let's jump in and talk about our Batik linen. I selected one of our hand-dyed fabrics. This is the linen in the shade of bright purple. This is what we're going to make our Fira top out of today. Our linen measures 54 to 56 inches wide. So when you're looking at the back of a pattern to decide on the yardage you need for your project, if it says 58 inches wide, you can definitely use the yardage without any concern at all. That's what I used when I cut out my fabric for this Fira top. Our linen is a light to mid-weight linen. If I were to describe the ounces, it is 4.8 ounces per square yard. So I don't know if that means anything to you, but it's kind of a light to mid-weight sturdiness. It is airy, and I keep saying the word lightweight because that is exactly what it feels like. You just don't even feel like you're holding fabric in your hand. It's really beautiful. When you care for your fabric and when you're prepping your fabric for cutting out your garment pattern pieces, make sure that you pre-wash your fabric using Synthrapol. We're always recommending Synthrapol, and it is a product by Pro Chemical. What it does and its purpose is to remove any of the surface dyes and wax that are left on the fabric after they are created by hand dyeing and stamping, and then they're dried, and then they're put on our bolts, and then they're shipped to us. Well, there's always a little bit of surface dye and wax that's left over, and you can feel it whenever you're touching your fabric. What we want to do is we want to wash any of that surface stuff away, and Synthrapol is the perfect soap to do that. The Synthrapol itself, you only need a teaspoon or two for a yard or two of fabric. And it is a soap, so you don't use any other detergent in your washing machine. You can also hand wash this if you'd like and let it just sit in your sink or your basin. Agitate it a little bit and then rinse it out until the water is clear. You will see color. You're always going to see color when it comes to washing a batik fabric, simply because its purpose is to remove the surface dyes and wax that are there. So you're going to see a little color. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the fabric. It just means that it needed to be washed. So then you can put your fabric into the dryer, or you can air dry it, whichever way. You know, I always tell people, use the method of drying and pressing that you would when you are preparing your garment to be worn. So if you would like to put your garment in the wash, hang it to air dry, do the same thing when you pre-wash and pre-care for your fabric before you've cut out your pattern pieces. The needles. One thing I like to work with is I really enjoy working with the Schmetz needles, a top stitching needle, which is a very sharp, strong needle. And you can use any size 80, 12, or lower. You can even, or smaller, I should say. The eye can be even smaller. So if you like a 75-11 or a 70-10, that's fine as well. You do not need anything larger than an 80-12 for sewing with the linen. You'll end up with a hole that might be just a tad bit too big. So just stick with an 80-12. I like to use either pattern weights or pins when I'm working with the linen. That is your choice. There isn't a right or wrong for any of that. And now the thread. I have on my sewing machine right now, I'm using So Fine, which is a 50 weight thread. And you could use 40 weight or 50 weight and work with polyester, cotton poly blend, or a cotton. It's your choice. If you have any questions about our Batik linen that I forgot to mention here, definitely put a question in the comment section below and we'll get you an answer. The Fira dress and top is written for woven fabric and it is for sizes 0 to a 20. And if you're not familiar with the Liesel and Company pattern sizing, I would say for this dress, the bust and your hip measurements are the most important. A 0 for a bust is 32.5 to a 46, and the hip is a 35 to a 48.5. And the wear ease and the finished measurement ease of this garment is about 4 to 5 inches more. So you're going to get that level of ease on the bust and your hips, which will give you a finished measurement for a 0 at the bust of 36, ranging to a 50, and at the hip a 39.25 to a 53.25. Now for myself, I'm normally in the size 12 to 14 range. So what I did, and I'm going to use the same measurements for my top as I did for this dress, is I started with a 10 at my shoulders and the arm. My bust area is the AB, and it is a 12. And then I graded it to a 14. And that seems to fit me really, really well. So take into account any grading that you might need for your garment. The style of this top is really a loose fitting pullover top. And it has a front yoke and a back yoke. There are slight gathers down the center of the back, and there is a center back seam. The front yoke, there's also gathers running across the shoulder and just a simple finish to the arm opening. When we sew our back yoke and front yoke together, we actually finish off the seam here very nicely, as well as turning in and top stitching the rest of the arm opening. The front facing has interfacing and sewn to the front V of our garment. If you're sewing the dress, it does have side seam pockets, which is great to have, and the top has a simple finished hem. Let's get started sewing our garment. The Fira top only has 5 pattern pieces. We have 2 back yoke, which are placed on the fold. Here's the back of the garment. This does not have a center fold. It is actually cut, so we'll have a seam running down the center of the back. I've snipped each one of our notches, and you can see here that I did grade out a little bit further on the hip area of the top. This is the front yoke, and there are 4 pattern pieces. Here's the front of the garment with the darts, and here's where you actually attach your perfect front. So you can select from the 3 different cup sizes. So I've taped the AB cup to the bottom portion of the dress and top. And then we also have the front facing. I've already taken time to interface the front facing, and I use NV silk. So if you purchase any of our kits that are working with the linen, we're going to have included in our kit will be the NV silk. And there's a separate piece that we need to have for the Fira top because we're going to reinforce the very center point of the front of the garment. The first step is to sew up our dart. So I'm going to take off the pattern pieces, and then we're going to pin this in place and stitch it up on the sewing machine. Now we're going to baste 3/8 of an inch away from our dart, keeping that in place. Next, we're going to take our facing and with our serger or your sewing machine, edge finish all the way around, only trimming to even up the edges. Now it's time to attach the facing to the right side of our garment. So with right side out, and now we have our facing piece, I took a minute to trace the stitch line from our pattern piece onto the interfacing side of the facing. This will make it so much easier to stay in line down to the dot and then back up again when we attach the facing to the front of our garment. So find a couple of pins, pin it in place. And then down at the dot. Now over at the sewing machine, backstitch at the beginning and the end, stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge and then follow your line down to the center dot, take 1 stitch across and then return and stitch all the way back up to the top edge of our facing. Next, we're going to cut all the way into our V, opening up our neckline. We're going to press the seam towards the facing and then go back to the sewing machine and understitch. This will keep the facing towards the inside of the garment when it's worn, because we're not top stitching along the V. So we want to make sure, we flip this over, that the facing stays in place. And understitching is the perfect way to do that. It's going to be beautiful. We each have our own techniques for how we determine how far away we are from the seam when we're doing understitching. I simply find a spot on my presser foot and then I follow that all the way down as far as I can possibly go with the understitching. There are sewing machine feet that you can put on your machine that will allow you to stay exactly the same distance away from your seam. But I simply find a spot on my presser foot and try to stay exactly that distance the whole way down the front facing. And then I stop about an inch or so, probably a little bit less, away from where I clipped into that center point, simply because the side seams themselves, or the seam itself, is already very narrow at that point. So there's my understitching, if you can see that. And so it goes all the way along the edge of our seam. So now I'm going to go over to the ironing board and we're going to press this flat. Pull the facing around to the wrong side of your garment and press in place. Our next step is to baste the facing in place. And I'm simply going to pin this, and then I'm just going to jump over to the sewing machine and baste that in place 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. Now it's time to finish the back of our garment. All we really need to do here is stitch our back seam together at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. One thing to think about, we are working with linen, and linen does fray. You can see how everything kind of frays a little bit as we move our pattern pieces and fabric around. So take that extra step and finish off the edges of your fabric. So if you have a serger, definitely finish your edges, or sew your seam using your sewing machine and then use a zigzag stitch or an overlock stitch to finish the seam edges. Now we're going to assemble the yokes, both the front and the back. This is the back yoke and this is the front yoke. We're going to take and with right sides together, see if I can slide this over here. With right sides together, we're going to pin the front yoke to the back yoke. Hopefully you can see this okay. I know it's a dark fabric. And we're going to create 2 sets. So another yoke here with the right sides matching and the right sides matching. So we're going to pin these in place and then sew our 1/2 inch seam allowance on all 4 pieces. Next, we're going to press our seams open, and then we're going to trim our seam down to 1/4 inch. You could trim your seam first and then press it in place. I like to press it first and then cut it, simply because it's easier to press open something that measures 1/2 inch than it does if it is 1/4 inch. At least that's kind of my experience anyway. One of the 2 yoke sets will now be the right side of the garment and one will be the wrong side of the garment. What we need to do is press under each of the outside edges of one of our yoke sets. The pattern instructions are to jump over to your sewing machine and sew 1/2 inch away from each of the 3 edges. Use that as your fold line to fold under 1/2 inch. I use my Clover hem guide to create my 1/2 inch by simply positioning the hem guide right along that edge, pulling my fabric over 1/2 inch and steaming it in place. I just find it so much easier to manipulate the fabric when I'm using this hem guide, which is perfect for ironing, and it really saves a lot of time. think the most important thing is to make sure that the folds are flat and straight, because these will become the outside edges of the yokes. Next, we're going to sew our 2 yoke sets together, right sides together. So I'm going to put the piece that has not been ironed on the bottom and then the ironed one right on the top. Let's match our seams at the sides and at the top. Before going to your sewing machine, make sure that each one of the folded yoke edges is about a 1/2 inch in from the unfolded yoke. We're going to stitch a 1/2 inch seam on each of the shoulders and around the neckline. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Now it's time to trim our seam allowances down to 1/4 inch, and I've already done that on our side seams here where our shoulders are, and then the neck area. And I'm simply also going to snip into the curved areas here so that when we turn this inside out, everything will lay really nicely. Okay. So now you want to turn this around, and we're going to press our seams, and just remember that the folded side is the outside of our garment and the unfolded side is the inside of our garment. So we want to roll everything when we're pressing it towards the inside. I'm working from the inside so that I can kind of see where my seam ends up, and I should be able to see the edge of the outside of the garment on the inside, just slightly. We'll roll that over. Takes a little bit of manipulation, and then we'll press. And it really does make a difference to clip those curves. And try not to stretch the linen. It has a tendency of moving, so definitely don't stretch it. Okay, so now we want to just roll this so that we can see just a little bit of the seam, or work it into your, with your fingers just to get as much of that seam open as you can. It takes a little bit to kind of move that seam around, and then press it in place. And then the other shoulder. Now it's time to sew our side seams together. With right sides together, match your notches that you put on the side seam. I really like to do this for linen, even if the markings are for pockets. I actually like to put the notches there anyway because it keeps everything lined up. I just don't want any of the linen to move or stretch. And if we can keep everything in position, that is going to be our success. Curve that up to the top. And I'm going to move that when I get over to the sewing machine. Match these notches. The arm opening and the underarm area here has a very tight curve. And whenever I'm working with a garment that has this tight of a curve, I am going to sew with my sewing machine a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to go over to the serger and seal the edges together. There are so many options for finishing the seams of this garment. You could have even done a French seam to finish this, because I think the linen is light enough to be able to do a French seam. But the one thing I'm going to do after I sew my side seam is I'm going to come back over here and clip about a 1/2 inch clips around this curve before I use my serger. And what that's going to do is give it a little play so that when I serge this, I won't have a tight curve, just tight with the overlock stitch. It'll allow it to move a little bit as I move when I'm wearing the garment. We're back at the ironing board, and now what we need to do is finish the open edge of our sleeve. The easiest thing to do, and what the pattern describes, is to go and use your sewing machine, sew a basting stitch a ½ inch away from the edge. We're going to use that as our guide for pressing and finishing the edge of our sleeve opening. I'm going to use my hem guide, and what I'm going to do is press a ½ inch away from the edge. It can get a little fussy right in the middle of a curve, but I do my best to make sure that I'm not stretching the fabric, but I'm still giving it a nice curved look. With that pressed edge in place, I'm going to tuck under my raw edge so that that raw edge touches that first fold line, and then we're going to press. This way I know that I have a 1/2 inch seam turned under that we're going to top stitch so that everything is a 1/2 inch. This will make sure that the yokes, once they're attached to our sleeve, will fit perfectly. To trim some threads away from the center here. Turn that under. There we go. And again, try not to stretch your fabric. I'm going to use a clip just to keep that center spot in place and the very ends. Clips work really nicely when we want to keep something in place before we're done pressing. Just want to make sure that's straight. Okay, we're going to do the same thing to the other sleeve opening, but we're going to top stitch all the way along the inside edge, finishing our sleeve opening. Before we leave the sewing machine, we're going to do our basting stitches. So the back of the garment has 2 notches, and in between those notches, we're going to increase the stitch length to be a basting stitch because we're going to gather our fabric between these 2 notches on the back, and then on each one of the yoke or the sleeve fronts, we'll have a little bit of gathering there as well. So 3/8 of an inch away from the edge will be our first gathering line, and then 5/8 inch away will be the second gathering line, which is really great because in between those two will be our 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we'll be able to have a really, really nice gather stitch in between our stitch line, and then we'll remove that basting stitch that will obviously show on the outside of the garment once we've sewn our back of the garment to the back yoke. On the front shoulder, we also need 2 lines of gathering stitches, so we'll put those 3/8 of an inch away from the edge as well, and 5/8 of an inch away from the edge. This is the tricky part of the Fira top, and hopefully I can describe this easily for you to understand. I have the garment laying on my table with the center seam of the back piece facing up. I tucked the front of the garment underneath so that it was out of the way. Here's the yoke, and on the top facing up, I have the portion of the yoke that has been folded. So this is the folded sleeve or shoulder and the folded back piece. Because what we're going to do, and it may not seem intuitive, but it's pretty clever, is we're going to position the unfolded edge of our yoke, okay, against the wrong side of our back top piece. So pin the center to the center seam. To find my pins here. Here we go. And we're going to keep this folded edge out of the way. And then we want to line up the edges, because we haven't yet gathered, we haven't pulled our gathering threads together yet. So we want to line this up, put some pins along the back piece, line the other side up, couple more pins. Now I want to show you something before I do any of the gathering. The folded edge of our yoke is going to become the right side of our garment, and we're going to top stitch this in place. So make sure that if you pull this over to the top, you see that this is the right side of the yoke or the outside of the yoke, and it will be against the right side of the back of our garment. Okay, so if it doesn't look like this when you fold the yoke over, go back and let's try this one more time. So let me put this back down, and I'm going to pull this aside. So now it's time to gather up our threads so that the back of the garment fits with the yoke. There's not a lot of gathers, so you don't have to do very much gathering, but pull it in because we're going to match our notches right there. Okay. And then also on this side. And then just distribute the gathers really evenly across the center of the back. Tuck that in there. Match your notches. Oh, my center came out. There we go. And just play with this a little bit until you feel comfortable with how everything fits together and that you like how the gathering stitches look. Just needs to be even across the back. And then I kind of wrap this around my pin so that it doesn't move. Do the same thing for the other side. Now pin that in place. And then we're going to sew our 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way across the back of the garment. I'm back at the pressing station, and here is the top outer back of our garment. And here's the seam we just stitched together. What I'm going to do is just gently press that seam up away from the back of the garment and into the yoke. I'm not even touching the center where it is gathered because I just don't want to flatten anything out. Feel comfortable that everything is lined up, that the outer edges are lined up, and that the folded portion of our back yoke lines up here, because what we're going to do next is top stitch all the way across the back. Now, what I'm going to do, just because I don't like working with pins, and if you've followed me for any amount of time, you know that I love working with double-sided basting tape. This is amazing sticky stuff that really helps us keep a folded edge like this in place so that it makes top stitching super easy and really even. So what I do is I'll take a little bit of this, I'm going to tip this towards the back because I put my basting tape on the folded edge of my yoke so that when I pull it over, I can position it really nicely instead of putting that double-sided basting tape on the actual seam itself. So I'm just going to take a little bit, and you can tear this with your finger, and then starting over on one edge, I'm going to get as close as I kind of think I can here and just tack down the edge of this fold with the basting tape. Now, I could have held this in my hand and gone all the way across, but I just do a couple of pieces to make sure that it stays in place. Right along the center. And this stuff is really, really great. It doesn't gum up your needle. It doesn't do anything but keep your fabric layers in place. So I'm going to tear off that second piece of paper, do one more little strip over on this edge. You can tell I'm a bag maker because I I love using this tape. It has so many uses. Okay, now I'm pulling this apart, and this fold is going to come down really nicely. And make sure that your edges are flat and aligned, and just position that in place really lightly, because if you need to move it, you still can. Tuck that under like that. And then over on this edge as well, making sure everything is aligned. And remember, your seam is tucked underneath the yoke, so everything is hidden. Do you see how that works? Very even. And I probably could have gone all the way across, but I think that will be just fine. So now what we're going to do is top stitch. This is the outside back of our garment. I'm simply going to top stitch right along this edge, keeping everything lined up nicely. There is the top stitching across the center back of our garment. Now we have the same steps for the front of the garment, and I am showing you here the back. Here's the back of the garment facing up, and I think this makes really good sense. Is now we have the folded edge of the yoke is on the top, because again, that's going to be the right side of our garment, and we have the unfolded edge on the bottom. That will be pinned to the wrong side of the garment's front piece, okay? Because when everything is said and done, this will be sewn, and then the front unfolded edge is going to be on the front of the garment, okay? Hopefully that will make sense. So if you have your garment right side out and you're looking at the back of the garment, we want to take our front yoke piece, and here's our shoulder seam, and pin it to the front piece of our garment. Now, of course, the yoke is smaller than the front piece because we have gathering stitches, and so we need to pin our edges together, wrong side to right side of the inside yoke. Hopefully that makes sense. I think lining up the edges seems to be the hardest part, to make sure that everything is even. And then we're going to line up the notches, pin those in place, and that'll show us how much gathering we need to do. There's the front edge. And there's our notch. So now we have to gather this much of the front piece of the garment. So find your threads, and we'll start gathering that across the top. This has a lot more gather to it than the center back of the garment does. So pull this across. Now you can pull from both edges if you like. I just like to pull on one side. A little bit more. Okay, and then pin that in place. And then we're going to sew our 1/2 inch seam along this edge. Just so that you know that everything is in place the right way, pull up your neckline and your sleeve. Make sure that the folded edge of the top yoke fits nicely over the front and that everything is the front of the garment. This is how you're going to know that you have the yoke on the right way. Okay, so now let's go over to the sewing machine. Sew our 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to come back and press the seam into the yoke. I'm going to use my basting tape again. It just seems to work. And then top stitch along the top edge of the yoke. Do the same step for the other side of our shoulder. I'm using a smaller ironing surface for finishing off the front. So I'm going to press the seam up into the yoke area without flattening out these gathering stitches. And just make sure that the folded edge comes down over the top of your stitching. I'm going to place a pin right at that edge. And also on the front neck area, I'm going to pin a couple of places here just to make sure it's flat. Remember, the folded edge should line up with your seam line, not the gathering stitches, because we want to take out those extra gathering threads. There, everything lines up really, really nice. And then we'll do this for the other side as well. Trim any threads or excess fabric. I have a little bit of a point there that I want to get rid of. And then I see a couple of threads here. These are the gathering threads. I wouldn't need to trim those, but I just like to get them out of the way so I know what I'm working with here. And then tuck our edge under the fold. Pull that around, and I'm going to place a pin again right in that edge. And then again on this edge, the front edge, line that up with the seam line, a pin right there. Now, I do want to press this just a little bit underneath there. Okay. And then we'll pull that over the top of our seam, right in the center, right there. And then I'm going to have to remove these gathering threads right below that. Now all we need to do is top stitch along the top edge here. Now again, use basting, double-sided basting tape if you'd like to put basting tape in place. It worked really great for the back. I just decided that I was going to use pins right along the front here because it's a shorter distance. We'll top stitch that, and the only thing we have left is the hem. I took a moment to turn the garment wrong side out to make it just a little bit easier to top stitch along the front shoulders. I'm going to have to work within the arm area. That's just the kind of the way that I thought that this would work the best. So that's what I have done. You can finish this any way that you'd like, but for me, that just seems to make the most sense. There we go. Now I have to remove my basting stitches, and my garment is almost done. I have to put the hem. I have to finish the hem. And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to show you each one of those steps, but what I'm going to do is serge the edge, and then I'm going to press it towards the wrong side about 5/8 of an inch and top stitch. I want to thank each of you for sticking with me through this tutorial. It was really a step-by-step tutorial. It took several hours this afternoon, and I did take a moment to press and hem my garment, and I really love it. And just to summarize, it is 2 yards of our batik linen. This is the hand-dyed bright purple, and I love the color. I just think it's such a rich color. The neckline on the garment is beautiful, the gathers on the shoulder, and I don't know if it's too long or not too long, but I think I really like the length. I think it's gonna look really great with shorts for this summer, or capris or something like that. So let me know below in the comments if you have any additional questions on constructing the Fira garment or working with any of the notions that I shared with you today or our batik linen. Definitely let me know. And on our website, you'll see every single one of the things that I used today, whether it be the interfacing, the patterns, the notions, and of course, we have 2 complete garment kits for you to choose any of our batik linen to make your own Fira top or dress. So until next time, keep sewing, smiling, and sharing.